He came home from war hoping to belong, only to be shunned by the very community he fought for. But in a dusty garage, Carlos built something far greater than acceptance. Before we begin Carlos's journey, a quick reminder: stories like this are often forgotten, but here on BetterStory, we keep them alive. If you value untold voices and hidden histories, please hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. Carlos was born under the vast skies of New Mexico, where the desert stretched endlessly, and the wind carried with it the scent of dust and gasoline. His family, of Mexican descent, lived humbly on the edge of town. Their small house was weathered but warm, always alive with the sound of Spanish lullabies from his mother and the clinking of tools from his father's garage. That garage was more than just a workplace. It was the heart of their home. From the time he was old enough to walk, Carlos was drawn to the world of engines. He watched his father work long hours, his hands blackened with grease, yet precise and steady as a surgeon's. The boy would hand over wrenches, hold a flashlight steady, and listen to the steady rhythm of ratchets turning bolts. In those moments, he wasn't just learning about cars, he was learning about life. His father taught him that every machine had a soul, that broken things could be made whole if one had patience and care. Carlos dreamed of one day owning his own garage. Not a big, flashy shop, but a place where he could stand on his own 2 feet and earn the respect of his community. In his heart, he believed that through hard work and honesty, he could rise above the poverty and prejudice that sometimes shadowed his family's life. His dream was simple, but powerful: to build something lasting with his own hands on his own land. But fate had other plans. The world was changing, and for young men like Carlos, dreams were often interrupted. As he grew into adulthood, the rumble of engines in his father's shop would soon be replaced by the thunder of war calling from across the ocean. And though he didn't yet know it, the lessons he had learned in that dusty garage, the patience, the resilience, the belief in repairing the broken would be the very things that carried him through the battles to come. When Carlos turned 20, his life took a turn he had both feared and expected. A letter arrived, neatly folded, carrying the weight of a country's demand. He was to serve. For many young men, it was a burden. For Carlos, it felt like an opportunity. He thought to himself, maybe now they'll see me as one of them. Maybe wearing the same uniform will erase the walls that set me apart. At the induction center, he stood in line with hundreds of others, faces pale with nerves, some trying to mask fear with laughter. As the barber's clippers buzzed and stripped away their hair, Carlos looked around. In that moment, everyone was equal. Gone were the clothes, the accents, the family histories. They were all just young men, transformed into soldiers by decree. For the first time in his life, Carlos felt invisible in the best way, not singled out, not judged, simply one among many. Training was brutal. The desert sun beat down during drills. His boots blistered, his body ached. The sergeants barked orders in voices sharp as whips. Yet Carlos endured. He carried with him the discipline he had learned in his father's garage: focus, persistence, patience. Just as he once rebuilt engines piece by piece, he began to rebuild himself into a soldier. And there was pride. The uniform was heavy, but it carried a strange comfort. At night, lying in the barracks, he ran his fingers over the patches on his sleeve and thought about his family back home. Now they can't say I don't belong, he told himself. He believed that his service, his sacrifice, would bind him to the very country that often treated him as an outsider. But Carlos didn't yet realize that war doesn't heal divisions, it deepens scars. The bond he felt with his brothers in training would be tested in ways he could not imagine, and the price of wearing that uniform would follow him long after the war ended. The day Carlos set foot on foreign soil, the world shifted. The air was thick with heat, the ground trembled with distant blasts, and the horizon was scarred by smoke. He wasn't in New Mexico anymore. He was in a place where survival was measured not in years, but in minutes. Carlos learned quickly that war cared little about who you were back home. It swallowed men whole, regardless of their skin color, accent, or last name. In the chaos of combat, everyone was the same: frightened, exhausted, desperate to see another sunrise. Carlos found solace in that equality, but it came at a brutal cost. Nights were the hardest. When silence fell, it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, broken only by the crackle of distant fire and the muffled sobs of men too young to be hardened. Carlos kept a small token from home, a metal key from his father's garage. In moments of fear, he pressed it into his palm, reminding himself of who he was before the uniform, before the killing. He built bonds with the men around him. They were brothers not by blood, but by circumstance, united by the knowledge that any day could be their last. Together, they laughed when they could, shared cigarettes, and whispered dreams of what they'd do if they made it home. Carlos didn't speak much, but his steady presence became a quiet anchor for those around him. Yet every bond came with a shadow. When men fell, their absence left a hollow echo inside him. Each loss was another weight on his chest, another ghost in his memory. He began to carry not just his own fear, but the voices of those who never made it back. For Carlos, the battlefield was more than mud and fire. It was inside his head, where memories etched themselves deep, refusing to be erased. Long after the fighting would end, he would learn that this war was not just fought overseas. It would follow him home into his nights, his work, his very identity. When the war ended, Carlos boarded the plane home with a strange mix of relief and dread. He carried nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of ghosts. As the engines roared and the land he fought on disappeared beneath the clouds, he told himself, "This is it. I've done my duty. Now they'll see me for who I am, a soldier, an American." The first sight of New Mexico filled his chest with something like hope. The desert stretched wide and familiar. The sunsets painted the horizon in the same colors he remembered as a boy. But as soon as his boots hit the ground, that fragile hope began to crack. There were no parades waiting for him, no crowds lining the streets, just silence. At the bus station, people avoided his eyes. Some glanced at the uniform and turned away, as if it were a reminder of something they wanted to forget. For Carlos, every step back into his hometown felt heavier. The streets were the same, but the people seemed different, colder, distant. He went looking for work, knocking on doors, filling out applications, factories, shops, even construction crews. Each time, he was turned away. Sometimes the rejection was polite, wrapped in excuses about being fully staffed. Other times, the truth was sharper, a muttered comment about his kind or a dismissive wave. The uniform that once made him feel proud now felt like a costume nobody wanted to see. Even among neighbors, the whispers followed. "That's Carlos," they'd say quietly. "Went to war, came back, not quite right." It didn't matter that he had risked his life for the same country as everyone else. To them, he was still an outsider, too Mexican to be fully American, too American to belong anywhere else. Carlos had dreamed of returning to respect, to belonging. Instead, he found himself standing in the same dusty town, lonelier than ever, haunted by memories and pushed to the margins of the very society he thought he had earned a place in. In the weeks after his return, Carlos tried to slip back into the rhythm of everyday life. He walked the same streets he had as a boy, heard the same church bells on Sundays, and smelled the same desert air. But everything felt unfamiliar, as if the world had moved on without him. The war still clung to him, invisible but heavy. At night, the echoes of gunfire rattled through his dreams. He woke in a sweat, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. By day, he fought another kind of battle, the quiet rejection of a society that had no place for him. The silence was the worst. Old friends avoided him, uncertain of what to say. Neighbors nodded politely but kept their distance. Even family dinners felt strained, with conversations tiptoeing around the subject of war. Carlos, who had once felt equal among brothers in uniform, now felt more foreign at home than he ever had abroad. He searched for work relentlessly, but each rejection carved deeper into him. The looks, the pauses, the muttered excuses, they all told the same story. He didn't belong. It wasn't just unemployment. It was erasure, as if his sacrifice counted for nothing. On some nights, he wandered back to his father's old garage, sitting in the dark, the smell of oil and rust filling his lungs. The empty space echoed with memories of a simpler time, when fixing cars was enough, when dreams felt possible. Now, those dreams seemed like another life, stolen by a war that had taken more than it gave. Carlos didn't talk about it. He carried his pain quietly, stitched deep inside where no one could see. The rejection wasn't loud or violent. It was subtle, like a slow, tightening grip that made it hard to breathe. Alone with his thoughts, he began to wonder if the war had truly ended, or if it had simply followed him home, hidden in the silence of those who turned away. One late afternoon, Carlos sat in the garage that had once belonged to his father. The space was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock and the faint smell of gasoline soaked into the concrete. He hadn't fixed a car in months. The tools were still there, scattered across the bench, but they felt like relics of another life. Then came a knock on the doorframe. A boy, barely 18, stood awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other. His clothes were worn, his eyes restless. Carlos recognized him from the neighborhood, a kid known more for trouble than hard work. "Mister," the boy asked hesitantly, "could you teach me how to fix an engine?" Carlos almost said no. He wasn't sure he had anything left to give. But something in the boy's voice reminded him of himself years ago. Hungry, uncertain, but hopeful. He sighed, motioned the kid inside, and pulled a wrench from the bench. At first, the lessons were clumsy. The boy's hands slipped, bolts rattled loose, and mistakes piled up. But Carlos found himself speaking with patience, explaining each step the way his father once had. "Tighten it slowly. Listen to the sound. Machines will tell you what they need if you pay attention." As the days passed, the boy returned, and with every visit, the garage grew a little less empty. Carlos began to notice a shift, not just in the young man, who stood taller with each success, but in himself. The silence that had weighed on him so heavily began to crack, replaced by the faint hum of an engine coming back to life. Teaching wasn't just about fixing cars, it was about repairing something deeper. In guiding another, Carlos felt a flicker of purpose, a reminder that his hands could still build, that his life could still matter. It was a small beginning, almost invisible. But in the dim light of that garage, it was enough to spark something Carlos hadn't felt in years, the possibility of hope. Words spread quietly, the way good things often do. The boy Carlos had helped told his friends, and soon another young man appeared at the garage door, then another. Some were restless teenagers on the edge of falling into the wrong crowd. Others were young veterans like Carlos, back from the war, carrying the same invisible weight, searching for something to steady their lives. At first, the garage was chaotic. Tools went missing, engines stalled, and laughter clashed with moments of silence. But Carlos didn't push them away. He remembered the loneliness of his own return, the cold stares, the empty days. Here, at least, these young men could put their hands to work and feel useful. The space began to transform. Old engines once left to rust found new life under eager hands. The air filled with the metallic rhythm of ratchets, the hiss of welding torches, the hum of motors sputtering back to health. Grease-stained rags hung from nails in the wall, and the floor bore fresh marks of work done with purpose. The garage wasn't polished or modern. It was raw, noisy, and alive. Carlos moved among them quietly, guiding with a nod, a few words, or sometimes just a steady gaze. He didn't need speeches. His presence spoke enough. The men came not just to learn about cars, but to feel less broken. Within those four walls, they weren't outsiders or failures. They were apprentices, mechanics, brothers in something that demanded both skill and trust. Little by little, the garage became more than a workplace. It became a refuge. For every engine repaired, a piece of someone's spirit was mended too. And for Carlos, who had returned home to silence and rejection, the sound of laughter mixed with tools was the sweetest kind of music. At first, Carlos thought he was only passing down what his father had taught him: how to hold a wrench, how to listen to the click of an engine, how to be patient with stubborn machines. But slowly, he began to realize something deeper was happening. Every time he showed a boy how to adjust a carburetor or replace a fan belt, Carlos felt a piece of his own life click back into place. The act of teaching forced him to speak again, to share knowledge rather than bury silence. When the young men looked at him with respect, with trust in their eyes, it reminded him that he was more than the whispers of rejection. He was a mentor, a craftsman, a man with worth. The garage became his therapy. The clang of tools replaced the echoes of gunfire. The smell of grease and oil overpowered the metallic scent of blood that still haunted his memory. Instead of seeing only loss when he closed his eyes, he began to see progress. Young hands steadying under his guidance, broken cars roaring back to life. And the conversations that unfolded while working were as important as the important pairs themselves. Between bolts and gears, the boys spoke of their fears, their anger, their dreams. Carlos listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just nodding. He knew the value of being heard. Too often, he had been denied that himself. One evening, as he watched the garage full of students cleaning up, their laughter bouncing against the walls, Carlos realized he was healing too. Not in dramatic ways. He still woke some nights in sweat, still carried ghosts, but the wounds were no longer festering in silence. They were being met with purpose, with connection, with hope. By teaching others to fix broken machines, Carlos was, in truth, learning how to fix the broken parts of himself. What began as a handful of curious boys soon grew into something larger. The garage that once stood empty and silent now buzzed from morning to night. Cars lined the street outside, waiting for repairs, while inside, young men bent over open hoods, their hands stained with grease and their faces marked with determination. But the work was only part of it. The garage became a gathering place, a kind of second home for those who didn't quite fit anywhere else. Veterans who had returned broken, with no one to talk to, found companionship among the smell of oil and the rhythm of tools. Teenagers who once drifted aimlessly began to arrive early, eager to learn, eager to belong. Carlos never advertised what he was doing. He didn't need to. Word spread because people could feel the change. The boys who came in restless and angry left calmer, steadier, more confident. Parents noticed. Wives noticed. Even the neighbors who once whispered about Carlos began to see the garage not as a blemish, but as a beacon. The place had no sign, no polished waiting room, no uniforms. Yet it carried something stronger. Trust. Every man and boy who stepped through those doors knew that they mattered there. They weren't judged for what they had lost or where they had come from. In the garage, they were mechanics, learners, brothers. Carlos watched it unfold with quiet pride. He never called himself a leader, never claimed credit. But as he saw the friendships forming, the laughter returning, the haunted looks in some eyes beginning to fade, he knew that something sacred was happening. The garage was no longer just his father's legacy or his own dream. It had become a community, a family, built from broken pieces, finding their way back together. Even as the garage thrived, the past clung to Carlos like a shadow that refused to let go. Some nights, after the last car had been pushed out and the laughter of the boys faded into silence, he sat alone at the workbench, staring at his hands. They were strong, steady hands that had taught so much, but in the stillness, they trembled. Sleep remained his enemy. Dreams dragged him back to the battlefield, to the sound of helicopters overhead, to the cries of brothers lost in the dark. He woke with his heart racing, the walls of the garage seeming to close in, the smell of oil and gasoline momentarily twisting into the stench of war. During the day, he wore calm like armor. He guided his students with patience, smiled faintly when they succeeded, nodded in approval when an engine roared back to life. But sometimes, in the middle of explaining a repair, his voice would falter. A memory would flash unbidden, and he'd have to turn away, pretending to reach for a tool so no one would see his eyes cloud. The community he built gave him strength, but it couldn't erase the scars. The war had carved itself into him, and though he had found purpose, he carried the weight alone. He never wanted to burden his students with his ghosts. To them, he was a mentor, a figure of resilience. To himself, he was a man still fighting battles no one else could see. And yet, there was a strange comfort in knowing he wasn't entirely alone. Many of the veterans who gathered in his garage carried the same haunted look, the same long silences when words failed. Together, without needing to explain, they understood. In that unspoken bond, Carlos found the closest thing to peace he had known since coming home. The true measure of Carlos's work didn't come from the engines he repaired, but from the lives that walked out of his garage stronger than they had entered. One of the first boys he taught, the restless teenager who had knocked nervously on his door, eventually landed a job at a local auto shop. Months later, he returned to the garage, not to learn, but to thank Carlos. He stood taller, his voice steadier, his eyes filled with a confidence that hadn't been there before. "You gave me something to hold on to," he said simply, before shaking Carlos's hand with a grip that spoke more than words. Others followed similar paths. One young veteran, who had once sat in silence in the corner of the garage, began speaking again, his laughter slowly returning. With Carlos's guidance, he opened a small roadside service station of his own. Another apprentice left to join a union, using the skills he had learned to provide for his family. Each success was like a spark, proof that the garage was more than a workshop. It was a place where futures were rebuilt. Carlos never asked for recognition. He didn't need thanks or praise. But every time a former student walked back through the door with good news, he felt something deep within his chest, a warmth that eased the cold weight of memory. It wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was about giving these young men what he himself had once longed for: a chance to be seen, to be valued, to belong. And slowly, the community outside the garage began to notice. Parents who had once worried about their sons now spoke of Carlos with respect. Neighbors who had whispered before now nodded with quiet acknowledgement when he passed. The man who had once been rejected was becoming something more, a cornerstone, not just for apprentices, but for the entire town. Over time, the quiet transformation that began in Carlos's garage rippled outward into the town. The same neighbors who once avoided his gaze now waved as he walked down the street. Parents spoke of him with gratitude, saying their sons had found direction and purpose because of the man in the garage. Even the local paper wrote a small article about how a humble mechanic was shaping lives one wrench at a time. For Carlos, the attention felt strange. He had never sought praise, and he wasn't comfortable being called a hero. He would shrug off compliments, insisting, "It's the boys who did the work. I just showed them how to turn the wrench." But deep inside, he felt something shift. After years of being dismissed, of carrying the sting of rejection, the respect now being shown was both healing and humbling. What moved him most wasn't the recognition, but the small moments. A mother bringing food to the garage as thanks, a young man's child waving to him on the street, a veteran quietly clapping him on the shoulder in silent solidarity. These gestures carried more weight than medals or ceremonies. They told him what he had always longed to hear, that he belonged. The garage had become more than a place to learn skills. It was a refuge, a school, a sanctuary, and now a pillar of the community. And though Carlos never raised his voice to claim it, people began to see him for what he truly was, a man who had taken his own pain and turned it into purpose. Yet Carlos remained grounded. To him, the work wasn't about legacy or reputation. It was about showing up each day, rolling up his sleeves, and making sure the next young man who walked through his door found the chance that Carlos himself had once been denied. Time, steady and relentless, left its mark on Carlos. His hair turned silver, his back ached from years bent over engines, and his hands, once quick and tireless, moved slower now. The garage floor, worn smooth from decades of footsteps, carried the story of countless lives that had passed through its doors. Yet every morning, Carlos still unlocked the garage and let the desert light spill across the tools and workbenches. The sounds of youth filled the space: laughter, music, the hum of engines. And though he no longer lifted heavy parts as he once did, he guided with words, with gestures, with wisdom carved by years of experience. The students he had once taught were now grown men, some with children of their own. Many returned, not as apprentices but as friends, bringing their sons to learn from the man who had given them a second chance. It was a circle Carlos never expected to see. Generations shaped by the same humble garage, by the same lessons of patience, discipline, and dignity. Age slowed his body, but sharpened his perspective. He no longer sought to prove himself to a world that had once rejected him. The respect, the belonging he had once chased had quietly taken root in the community around him. Carlos had become more than a mechanic. He was a keeper of stories, a bridge between the broken past and the repaired present. At night, when the garage lights dimmed and silence returned, the weight of memory still pressed on him. But now, instead of loneliness, there was gratitude. He had not erased his scars, but he had built a life where they no longer defined him. By the time Carlos reached his 70s, the garage had become more than a workplace. It was a landmark, stitched into the very fabric of the town. People spoke of it not as Carlos's garage, but simply the garage, a place everyone knew, a place where countless lives had been rebuilt alongside rusted engines. The apprentices he once taught carried his lessons far beyond those oil-stained walls. Some became mechanics, others opened businesses of their own, and many returned to say that what they learned wasn't just about engines, it was about dignity, discipline, and resilience. The garage had sent ripples of hope outward, touching families, neighborhoods, even entire generations. Stories of Carlos's quiet influence spread. A boy who might have ended up in trouble found a trade instead. A veteran who had nearly given up discovered brotherhood once more. Fathers passed down the tale of the mechanic who believed in them when no one else did. In these ways, Carlos's legacy grew, not carved in stone or written in history books, but etched into the lives of ordinary people. Carlos himself never spoke of legacy. To him, it was always simple. Fix what's broken, guide those who are lost, keep the doors open. But those who gathered there knew better. They saw the garage for what it truly was, a symbol of what one man, scarred by war and rejection, could create with patience, kindness, and work. And so the garage stood not just as a building filled with tools, but as a monument of healing, where the sound of laughter mixed with the hum of engines, and where broken lives found a chance to run again. In the quiet years of his life, Carlos often sat at the entrance of the garage, a worn chair beneath him, watching the sun dip below the desert horizon. The sounds inside, laughter, clattering tools, the hum of an engine coming to life, were no longer his to command, but they filled him with a deep, steady calm. He no longer fought to prove himself, no longer carried the bitterness of rejection. Time had softened the sharp edges of his memories, though the scars of war and years of silence never fully disappeared. Instead of haunting him, they had become part of his story, woven into the legacy he had built. Sometimes, former students came to visit, now with children of their own. They brought their sons and daughters into the garage, proudly introducing them to the man who had once guided their first uncertain steps. "This is Carlos," they'd say. "He taught me not just how to fix cars, but how to stand on my own feet." Carlos would smile quietly, humbled, his eyes reflecting gratitude more than pride. In those moments, he understood something he hadn't in his youth, that peace doesn't always come from the world giving you what you deserve. Sometimes it comes from creating your own place in it, brick by brick, engine by engine, life by life. As the desert nights grew cooler, Carlos still woke at times with echoes of the past in his dreams. But when he opened his eyes, he no longer felt alone. He had built a family, not of blood, but of choice, a family forged through grease, steel, patience, and compassion. And in that, at last, Carlos found the peace he had been searching for all his life. Carlos's story reminds us that war does not always end when the fighting stops. For many veterans, the greatest battles are fought in silence, long after the uniform is folded away. He returned to a world that did not welcome him, a community that saw him as different, and a life that felt shattered. Yet, instead of letting rejection define him, Carlos chose another path. In the quiet of his father's garage, surrounded by rusted tools and broken engines, he discovered that healing could be found not in forgetting the past, but in building a future. One apprentice at a time, he turned despair into opportunity. One repaired car at a time, he taught that even the most broken things could run again. Carlos did not set out to be a leader or a symbol. He only wanted to belong. But in creating a place where others found acceptance, he built something greater than belonging. He built a family. His garage became more than a shop. It became a sanctuary, a legacy of hope forged from oil, steel, and compassion. Today, Carlos's life stands as a quiet testament that dignity is not given, it is made, that purpose can rise from pain, and that sometimes the most ordinary places, a dusty garage in a small town, can become extraordinary. Every veteran, every survivor, every broken dream carries a lesson. Join us on BetterStory, subscribe now, and be part of keeping these stories alive.